Welcome everybody for being here today. This is a great day for our research teams. You know, they just get the opportunity to speak to the providers and set forth all of their hard work that they've done all semester long. So that, and in conjunction with our wonderful walkthrough of Men's Central Jail, which I think changed all of our lives and where we know we don't want to end up, was quite enlightening. And I think hopefully we'll all learn a little bit of something about the project they've been working on. I will say, just from a format perspective, the students will go ahead and present out for about 45 minutes. And then afterwards, we're going to invite them to sit at the table and make it more of a round table and really a conversation, deferring to the providers for questions, but much more casual environment so that you guys can really tease out whatever you'd like to tease out and go from there. So with no further ado, I will turn it over to Team Barger.
Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Kiara Galloway.
My name is Zain Khan.
My name is Lily Ramirez.
My name is Delarice Nagitari.
My name is Ari Gubian.
My name is Samba Sami.
And we're the research group that studied Men's Central Jail and the SEQA reforms. On behalf of all of us, I would like to say welcome, and as well, thank you for the wonderful opportunity to research what we researched this semester. It's been a wonderful semester, I can say, for all of us, and just been a great way to introduce us to LA County and everything. I would like to provide you guys with a roadmap before we get started. So the first half of this presentation will focus on Men's Central Jail and the closure and the next steps, and then by myself, Lily, Zane, and Delarai. And then the second half will focus on SEQA reforms to address affordable housing by Unruh and Samba. I will go ahead and get started with the closure of Men's Central Jail and the next steps. As you all may know, LA County is historically a carceral state focused on punitive measures compared to rehabilitation. The carceral state is the ideologies and structures of policies that result in criminalization and punitive measures. Carceral states lead to what we see in Men's Central Jail. High incarceration rates are the most stigmatized in our society. So we see the criminalization of people who are homeless, mentally ill, and dealing with substance abuse disorders at high rates because law enforcement is the first responder over community-based organizations in carceral states, leading to criminalization. So after years of pushing from advocates in LA County was forced through Measure J to consider alternatives to incarceration. And this year's research group was tasked with the following question in accomplishing the goal of closing Men's Central Jail. An assessment of the JFA Institute report to identify the most appropriate facility and staffing model to safely house and treat the mentally ill population in LA County jails who cannot safely be diverted to community-based treatment. I will first discuss the history of Men's Central Jail to classification, which will help us better understand our facility recommendations at the end for rehabilitation over punishment. Zane and Lily will then discuss case studies that will better help us form a facility that would better help mentally ill inmates, and concluding with Delarai, who will give us the presentation recommendations. So I'll get started with the history of Men's Central Jail. Men's Central Jail opened up in the 1960s, and it's the oldest functioning jail in Los Angeles County. It serves as a central hub for the whole LA County jail system, and it's an important fixture in it for the functions of the jail that it provides. Opening shortly before the Latterman-Petrus Short Act, which closed all mental asylums and hospitals in order to replace with community-based services and support, which sounds familiar as what we're doing today. But in the 60s, that unfortunately didn't happen. The carceral environment from the 60s, in combination with aggressive policing, cuts to subsidized housing, and mental health services, created the perfect storm for the mass criminalization of the mentally ill in LA County. And this is what happened and what we see in Men's Central Jail. The history of what LA County is, this is a history of what LA County is attempting to turn away from with a new facility that's rehabilitative. The philosophy of criminalization needs to change within the criminal justice system in LA County, but also the dilapidated conditions inside MCJ do too. So the issues inside Men's Central Jail is that Men's Central Jail lies, the problems inside Men's Central Jail lies in the population. So 40% of the population is pre-trial offenders who have not seen their day in court while staying only approximately 10 days within the prison. And studies have shown that inmates are suffering negative impacts of being in the carceral environment. MCJ is specifically hostile because of the negative, as evident by the tour of the jail. So what we saw in March was that there was a lack of privacy and confidential spaces for the mentally ill population. And there was also a lack of group rooms or recreational activities that would prepare them for re-entry to society. There was also structural problems inside the jail that included regular flooding of the cells, and there was a lack of air conditioning. Therefore, the conditions of the jail were just not proper for rehabilitating mentally ill residents in the jail. And as well, inmates are spending entirely too short of a time inside the jail to receive rehabilitative services. As you can see from the carceral state inside men's central jail, it acts as a punishing value versus a rehabilitative value. So the alternatives incarceration, the lack of resource and structural conditions of men's central jail also creates a cycle of the mentally ill going from jail to hospital, using up the county's most expensive resources because they're spending entirely too short of amount of time in the jail. As well as the problems inside the structural facilities is in the functions of the jail because of the high population. So now we'll talk about the classification problems inside the jail that lead to overclassification and misclassification. Assuming as you're well versed in the inmate reception and classification process at MCJ, you also know how highly concentrated the flow is of the inmates into the prison and how problematic the reception center is. MCJ acts as a centralized hub for the LA County prison system. So all inmates interacting in the system eventually get processed through the inmate reception center inside Men's Central Jail. So the current structure is as follows. So any mentally ill inmate is coming from either the county court or the station jail that's not equipped to handle their health needs and go straight to Men's Central Jail where they're processed for mental health process or custody levels. We're currently focusing on the mental health process because it's problematic. As discussed with the inmate and expert in residence, Dr. Tim Belovich, the problem with the IRC is that there's only 8 nurses in total who process the inmates for mental illness and to go into the mental ill population. As well, those nurses aren't psychiatrically trained to do psychiatric diagnosis. So according to Dr. Belovich, 75 to 80% of the mental health classification is determined by previous history, and the other 25 to 20% is on the outward appearance and physical behavior of the inmate. Because there's such a large influx of inmates going through the classification area, the interviews for classification is less than 10 minutes long. So as you can see from the conversation of the classification section, overclassification is of course going to happen because there's not enough time to properly diagnose or to properly put mentally ill people to rehabilitative sources. The interview determines their mental health status. Belovich and other officers inside MCJ also confirmed other classification issues such as underclassification and overclassification due to inmates not wanting to be in general population, which is an issue because if they're being moved to the mental health population, there's not enough room for the other actually mentally ill people. Belovich and other officers inside MCJ say that these problems come from the lack of nurses, the short visits, the 10 days, and just the harms of the carceral environment because it's not a rehabilitative state. From the historical carceral behavior of LA County and the current conditions of MCJ, it's important that LA County considers examples of how to be a rehabilitative community justice process. I'll now pass it to Zane to discuss and state examples of how LA County can divert populations inside MCJ to a rehabilitative state.
Hi everybody, I'm Zain. Lily just introduced me, so I hope you all remember that. So now we're going to be doing in-state best practices. While we had a good, we went through a background of what is happening at MCJ, we also can't just focus on what happened. We need to now move on to and see what we can do. And the best way to do this is look at some things that have already happened. I will be looking at things that have happened within the state of California, whereas Lily will be looking at things that have happened outside of California. So let's begin. I will be doing in-state best practices. So what will I be going over? The two counties I am using as model counties are San Francisco County and San Mateo County. I always confuse it to be San Bernardino, don't know why. So San Francisco and San Mateo. Why have I chosen these? It is important to acknowledge that these two counties don't necessarily match up to the inmate population that LA County has. However, both the counties are similar in demographic to Los Angeles, right? And why do we want that? Is because we are going to try and look at community programs, and if the community is not in sync with Los Angeles, we can't be using these as models, which is why I'm looking at these two. So let's go into specifics. San Francisco. What can we learn from San Francisco? The first thing we can learn is San Francisco's county diversion program. The word diversion seems very off-putting, yes, but what is it essentially? Let us try to understand it. So what San Francisco does is it has a post-booking diversion program where it evaluates inmates based on their mental health. And this is something counties do, but in a very limited manner. Mental health is not prioritized, and that is because of the carceral state that he just talked about. So what do? So this is where the inmates in the jail are seen if they are eligible to partake into this diversion program. Now, who makes this decision? We can't just have officers make these decisions. So the decision is made by a team of judges, lawyers of both sides, mental health care providers, and the jail psychiatric services. While I will also touch upon different jail psychiatric services, it is important to note that a county diversion program helps do two things. First, it helps address the problem of the overcrowding and overpopulation that we're seeing in LA County. And COVID was in a way, like from our conversation with the deputy sheriff that when we went for the jail visit, he said COVID was in a way a blessing in disguise because the population of the jail started falling down. But however, as we return back to the new normal, we are again seeing that the jail population is going on the rise. So a diversion program definitely helps address that situation. And the second situation is it prioritizes mental health. Because if we are gonna lock up the inmates in a room without the proper facilities and amenities, we will not be making progress. And I think it's time to break the wheel. So when we move on to the next practice, this is something very specific, and I think this is something that's not, like I would say, completely done here in LA County. What is it? So San Francisco County Jail Ward has two wards in the San Francisco General Hospital, right? They have the Ward 70 and Ward 7L. Ward 70 is a locked ward, which is just for intensive medical care. But for this purpose, for this study, we'll be focusing on Ward 7L, which is an intensive psychiatric unit. And that is what we want to do because our focus of study is the mental health condition of the inmates. So what is this one? It essentially just caters to the mental health needs. So to put it in the most plainest manner, it is essentially a prison inside a hospital. So they have the security, they have the sheriffs and the deputy sheriffs and officers guarding it, but they also come with the added benefit of having all the medical resources, having the trained and professional staff, all at one place. So this is something that we also got to know from Dr. Belavich's interview was when he recommended having clinics on each floor. So because like he already said, there is a short staffage. So if we don't address that problem, we can't cater to the mentally ill in the jail. Now we move on to San Mateo County. San Mateo County, while San Francisco County had specific programs we could look at, like the diversion program and the award system, San Mateo County gives us a general overview. This we'd be doing in two stages. So the first one is assertive community programs. Like I stressed, San Mateo community is quite similar to LA County's community. So if we want to employ community assertive programs, we need to look at San Mateo. Now what are these? These are crisis intervention, behavior evaluations, regular appointments, group therapy, individual therapy. Now what all this does is it caters to the mental health requirements of those that are mentally ill. The reason why we think as a group and also individually why this is important is because what the current system of the jail system in LA is doing is two things. First, Those that are coming in who are already mentally ill, they are leaving this facility with even more worse conditions. And second, those that are not coming in with mental illness, they are leaving with mental illness. So that means that MCJ and the jail facility is the problem. So we wanna address that problem, and this is how we do it by acting on it and by learning from our neighbors. And the second one is transitional restrictive housing. Now this is something that is a new program too in San Mateo. So transitional housing, the word itself suggests it, is essentially mimicking the environment of the real world of the community before you transition the inmates or before you make them leave. Now what does this do? What happens is when most inmates are when they serve their sentences out and they leave, it creates a lot of homelessness, and that is because some of them don't necessarily connect, or some of them do not have the facilities or resources to connect. What does the transitional or restrictive housing do is, before they are discharged, they are placed into environments that mimic the outside world. What happens is they are given a source of livelihood, so for example, a job within the prison. They are given more interaction time with other inmates, or even with the officers. This, in a way, I would say implicitly prepares them, because they would eventually have to go out. And when they do that, through transition housing is when they connect them to housing services. So this also helps us look at how we can tackle the problem of homelessness too. And finally, there are different types of transition housing. There's one that's for mental health, there's one for addiction, called sober transitional housing, and we believe that addiction, substance abuse is something that is definitely playing I would say, integral role in the mental health condition of these individuals too. And finally, you've heard me go on and on about programs. You've heard me go on and about as to what can we do, what can we adopt. But I do realize and acknowledge that our research question wants us to address one main part, and that is, what is the facility? We have the programs that we can learn from, but because MCJ is being broken down, where do we implement it? This is something I've taken or built on the second scenario of the JFA report that was shared with us from the provider's office. And this is something I also spoke with Commander Hugo Marcius from the Office of County Diversion Services. I think Miss Christina connected me to him. And when we had a conversation, and from the JFA report, this is to understand this, we need to understand the current layout of what the prison is. So we have the Miraloma County Prison, which is not in LA County, it's in Miraloma, yes. But in LA County, we have MCJ and we have Twin Towers. These are the two large prisons, I would say. MCJ caters to mostly men, and Twin Towers caters to the females. So what this scenario suggests is that we move the females from Twin Towers to Miraloma. We move a part of MCJ's population to Twin Towers, and the remaining part of MCJ would be moved into a newer facility. Now what I recommend based off of this is that if the new facility is to be built, the diversion could be based on the mental health illness, so that we have a separate facility just for inmates with mental health problems. So when we do that, we are also creating an environment which is focusing on mentally ill people, and we are also helping inmates who are not mentally ill not be in the same environment. So creating a diversion based on mental health illness also helps. Prioritizing mental health is an important thing that we think should be done, and re-entry programs, giving inmates more jail employment and livelihood. That was my in-state practices, and I hope that if I didn't bore you, I at least caught your attention. If not all programs, at least one of them could be implemented in LA County. And because MCJ is a huge prison, there is definitely going to be many challenges, but I feel like if we go through them step by step, we can definitely make a difference. Now that we've looked at things inside California, let's look at things outside California. So with that, over to Lily on out-state practices.
Thank you, Zain. So I will be focusing on out-of-state case studies and how these case studies and their programs and facilities can be applied to a new facility at LA County. So my presentation will focus on two parts: addressing the JFA report, which was our assessment that we were given, and the most crucial part of this entire presentation for Barger with regards to the MCJ facility. So basically the two main issues, as I will go over the next two slides, are, as have been mentioned, staff shortages and a non-therapeutic environment for these facilities to take place. As has been previously mentioned, being in these environments in this carceral state can lead to greater mental health issues for those who already have it, and can lead those who didn't even come in with mental health issues with some rates of lower mental health designations such as anxiety and depression and things like that. And then the second part of my presentation will focus on 2 case studies. Cook County is widely considered the gold standard. As you will see, I have specific data that talks about how they were able to reduce recidivism rates by 50% by including their programs and their facility design. And then conversely, I have case study 2, which is Rikers Island, which is a pretty negative example of an infamous jail with lots of violence, and that will point to the importance of staffing and how shortages can be very detrimental. So first I will talk about the JSA non-compliance issue number 1, which is staff shortages. As you can see here with the statistic, there's a severe mental health shortage. Only 57% of 300 budgeted positions are currently being filled due to a lack of supply for these issues. And so that's 170 out of 300. So there's 130 open spots. And I got these statistics from Dr. Belovich in our correspondence. And within these positions, there's a special need for social workers, psychiatrists, and psychologists, among other positions. And one of the reasons that for this gap is that it's very hard to recruit for the jail facility. There's just a lot of negative stereotypes and perceptions of what it's like to work in a jail. Therefore, it's a vocational job and it's hard to recruit for. However, there's a possible solution from the supervisor's side that could possibly be implemented, even though it's a larger state and federal issue. And this would be to advocate for loan forgiveness programs for healthcare professionals working near jail facilities. There are already loan forgiveness programs for other different types of healthcare workers, but if we could incentivize people in LA County, which is the largest county in the country and has a large population of healthcare workers, if we can incentivize them to transition into the jail environment, or we can work on incentivizing students that are currently studying our population to work in the jails, because it would help offset nursing program debt and medical school debt, which we all know is crazy these days. So that's a possible solution for staff shortages, which is the first issue addressed in our report. So the second non-compliance issue is facility issues, as has been previously addressed. So MCJ currently has the old linear design of the jail. It's very old-fashioned, it's basement style, no natural light, many things that will be touched on later. However, there are no mental health treatment facilities, and there's only 2 small clinics currently in the jail. It is not conducive to treat the mental health population, as has been discussed before. And also there's no modular layout, which is now widely considered the best layout for jails by the National Institute of Corrections. Also, so our current designated mental health facility within the county is TTCF, or Twin Towers Correctional Facility. And they do have the modular layout, which is widely selected as the best. However, it's become crowded and it's not conducive to treatment due to bunks being in the day rooms and not having confidential spaces to do the treatment, which is one of the problems that the DOJ mandate told us. And one of the reasons for this is the modular layout was actually conceived for the general population and not the mental health population. So it's not being used to its full capacity, and therefore, as we will go further in the recommendations Delray will talk about, building a mental facility or a jail with the mental health population in mind is extremely important, and moving around the spaces, as has been talked about before with myeloma and transitioning, can lead TTCF to be used the best way possible, and that's what we'll be touching on in a bit. Okay, so Cook County, Chicago. This is a program, the Mental Health Transitional Center, that was started by Sheriff Thomas Stark, and it is widely considered the gold standard of jails. And as you will see, I'll get to the bottom, 50% reduction is a huge deal, and something that could be implemented hopefully here. But basically, Cook County is the largest single-site jail in the country, and it houses about 6,000 inmates at a time. And the Mental Health Transitional Center is a detached, isolated therapeutic facility, and maybe this may not be conducive to a current design, but if we can implement the practices involved here, we can transition those into a new mental health facility that would be built here in LA County. So phase 1 of the program is 6 weeks of daily group sessions. And this is very important because a lot of the mental health issues are a lot of crimes are directly correlated to mental health issues, especially things like anger management. And if we can teach inmates to self-regulate their emotions, we can prevent further crime. Also, phase 2 goes even further in this rehabilitative effort. It involves GAD, GED, study sessions, and job readiness training to acclimate inmates to real world again. And there are over 100 mental health staffers employed for a population of 6,000 inmates, which is more appropriate given that we have more than 2.5 times that, but only 170 current mental health professionals working. And then very important, in 2017, because many of these efforts, 40 years of jail oversight was ended under Sheriff Dart's role as leader of Cook County Jail. And given that we are currently under a mandate and being supervised by the DOJ, following this model could hopefully end oversight of our LA County facilities in the future. And then lastly, as I mentioned before, a 2018 Sheriff's Office analysis found that there was a 50% reduction in 30-day recidivism for program participants. So they found that it went from 8% to 4%. 4% were for people who were in the program, that worked in the mental health transitional facility, and 8% of inmates were not. And therefore, 50% reduction was made in 30-day recidivism, which is a crucial metric to see how likely people will come back to cycle in the system. Oh, and then last, I'm sorry to leave you on a negative note, but that's just how my slides worked out. So this is Rikers Island, New York. I'm sure many of you know of the infamous violence that has taken place many times over many decades here at Rikers Island. However, I just wanted to emphasize how important staffing shortages are to violence and just inefficiency in the jail environment. So as you can see here, the lack of staff is crucially detrimental to the entire experience of the jail, both the staff and the inmates themselves. So in 2018, 30% of over 4,000 use of force incidents were deemed unavoidable or unnecessary. And then conversely, over 2,000 assaults happened on staff from the month of January to September in 2021. And that is equivalent to 8 assaults each day. And many of that is due to the wide open land, as you can see here. It was very hard to properly staff something this large. And obviously this was not something to be replicated in Los Angeles, but it's just a good reminder of how we can learn from other states and other things that have not worked in the past. And then how does this relate to the mental health population? So 45 individuals that have used the most force against other inmates and staff are mentally ill inmates. And they compose, just these 45 people compose 15% of all the violence that has been happening in the jail recently. And this implication is that Rikers needs not only more staff, but better de-escalation practices. So as much as this is a negative example, it's not really, because it's something that we have an opportunity to grow and learn from. And now I'll be passing off to Delarai, who will be speaking about overall recommendations.
All right, thank you, Lily. So I will be looking at what a new mental health facility should entail. All right, so we are basing our new facility off of scenario 2 within the JFA report. So just to review, scenario 2 within the JFA report argues for the transfer of female inmates from the Twin Towers to the Muir Wellness facility. And the Bureau of Justice actually reports that female inmates are more likely to have mental illnesses than their male counterparts. So ensuring that that transition is done properly and that female inmates are living in safe and proper housing conditions is important for improving mental health within inmate populations in general. The JFA report also calls for the renovation of the Pitches Detention Center East as a minimal security prison. And the plan for this renovation includes renovating housing facilities, restroom facilities, visitation areas, and the recreation area. Additionally, the JFA report has 4 depopulation strategies that can be implemented that are thoroughly listed throughout the report. And finally, the JFA report within scenario 2 calls for the creation of a new mental health facility. All right, so when looking at the creation of a new mental health facility, within our facility, we want to incorporate a modular direct supervision model. that has clinics on each floor for medical treatment, wellness rooms that incorporate cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as natural light. And when designing our model, one thing that we really wanted to keep in mind is that rehabilitation is not inherent to incarceration. It is something that needs to be actively implemented into the infrastructure and services of a jail. All right, so the first thing that we want to incorporate is the podular direct supervision model. This is a diagram from the National Institute of Corrections of a podular direct supervision model. Podular direct supervision models are the latest generation of jails. They include a central day room where guards and inmates are housed during the day with surrounding cells. Podular direct supervision models create a less hostile environment because they remove physical barriers. This removal of physical barriers improves contact between correctional officers and inmates, and the National Institute of Corrections found that this increased contact between inmates and officers created a safer and more trusting environment through an audit, a national audit of jails with direct supervision models as opposed to those with linear intermittent models as the MCJ has and podular remote supervision models. So in addition to having a direct supervision model in order to increase contact between correctional officers and inmates, we also want to incorporate clinics on each floor of the facility, and this is actually a suggestion from Dr. Belovich himself. Having a clinic on each floor improves efficiency for the staff because it allows the staff to move from the different floors instead of waiting in one clinic for a cohort of inmates to come to them. Moreover, it also improves convenience for the distribution of medication, especially mental health medication that needs to be taken several times a day. All right, so in addition to having the podular direct supervision model with clinics on each floor, we also want to incorporate wellness rooms on each floor, which may seem like an out-of-pocket thing to have within a jail, but wellness rooms are known to improve rehabilitation and to lead to spatial differentiation for inmates, which is important for adjusting to life outside of the jail itself and being able to differentiate between their cell and other spaces within the jail. Wellness rooms also create a sense of autonomy and confidence within the jail. And within these wellness rooms, we want to incorporate cognitive behavioral therapy. So these cognitive behavioral therapy rooms should be soundproof in order to maintain the privacy of the inmates. And although having soundproof cognitive behavioral therapy rooms and cognitive behavioral staff may sound like a costly investment, it is actually a very worthwhile investment because cognitive behavioral therapy has been proven to reduce violence within jails and also reduce recidivism rates by 25%. And as the country with one of the highest recidivism rates in the entire world, this is an extremely important thing to address. Moreover, cognitive behavioral therapy has, for every dollar spent on cognitive behavioral therapy, there's been a savings yield of $6.31 in criminal justice costs, and that was found by the Stanford Social Innovation Project. So it's a worthwhile investment. Finally, we want to incorporate natural light into our facility. So the American Corrections Association requires all adult inmates to have access to natural light, and for every 10 hours of confinement, inmates need to have access to a 3-foot window. Natural light has been proven to improve mood, cognition, and overall mental health, and there is a correlation between access to natural light and decreased rates of both anxiety and depression. Natural light is also proven to improve physical health, so it is beneficial for inmates' overall health. In addition to having natural light, we also want to have light fixtures that, instead of harsh fluorescent lighting that stays the same amount of lighting throughout the day, we want to have lighting that changes throughout the day to mimic outside light, and this is important for improving circadian rhythm cycles, which also leads to better mental health and cognition. And incorporating these changes benefits both inmates and correctional officers who actually spend a larger majority of their lives in the jail than do most inmates. And this is actually a photo of the Las Colinas facility in San Diego, just to show that having natural light within a facility is a very feasible thing to do. And all of these different features to this facility of having modular drug supervision to improve trust, and then adding in clinics and wellness rooms and natural lights to improve mental health and make it a better facility, not only improve the mental health of the inmates and their overall living conditions, but also help to destigmatize jails and create a less carceral society overall. So with that, we would like to thank you for listening to our portion on the North Central Jail. And I'm going to hand it over to Alma and Saba to discuss SEQA, and we're excited to answer any questions that you may have about MCJ or SEQA at the end of their presentation.
All right, thank you. Now the fun stuff. So as Delray mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit about SEQA. First thing I wanted to do is frame the research question that we were tasked with, and I'd like to read it in full. How can we bypass California Environmental Quality Act challenges on affordable housing developments to address LA's housing crisis? This is what we were tasked with studying. So what we're going to do is first we're going to talk a little bit about the housing crisis itself, give some context. Then the law, its history and its original intent, the process of SEQA, its evolution and misuse, and finally reforms. So the crisis. We are in a major crisis today in California and LA as well, as far as housing is concerned. The median home price is $700,000, the median condo price is $515,000, and the median rent is $1,700. Renters and home buyers all need to qualify with an income of over $100,000 a year to even qualify for any type of housing. So we see again it's further and further out of reach of the average Evangelino, average California, and it's becoming a major reason why so many are leaving California, because they're being priced out. Now California ranks 48 out of 50 in income inequality in the country. 35% of Californians live at or below the poverty line, and the price premium, this I think is important to note. The price premium is the average price of a home in California compared to the national average. Between 1940 and 1970, that number was at 28%. From 1980 to 2000, it went up to 120%. And what I'd like to note is 1970 is when SEQA came into law. So we can draw some conclusion that it wasn't probably the direct reason, but it obviously has a major impact on this price going through the roof. So, SEQA itself. That's not good. There we go. So SEQA itself. SEQA remains until today the premier, the gold standard environmental protection law in California. And indeed it was well intended. The protection of the environment is a worthwhile and important issue. Its purpose was to protect the environment, protect the community with major public developments, things like highways, and importantly create protocols at the state and local level and study and analyses on these various environmental impacts. So, I know we can't read this graph, but I think it's important to show it because it illustrates the convoluted and complicated process, the bureaucratic process that developers have to do to get through SEQA. They have to jump through all these hoops. Now, the purpose of this is to meet requirements in 16 different categories. They range from aesthetics to geology, and you have to meet these requirements in order to get any sort of approval. It's part of the initial permit process. And most importantly, the local agencies in LA County or wherever it may be throughout the state are tasked with these studies. They have to analyze what the potential risk may be, and based on the gravity of that environmental risk, create mitigation measures. And one thing I'd like to note, and we'd like to keep this in mind when we get to the reforms, is the discretionary power of our local agencies. They have the ability, when they conduct these studies and analysis, they have a little bit of freedom to set their own thresholds and analyze the threat's effect on their community and how it might be different from somewhere else in California. And an example of that is in the Bay Area. The Bay Area Air Quality District controls the pollution in the air in 9 counties in the Bay Area. Now they set their CO2 emission cap at 10,000 metric tons per year, while the SEQA state recommendation was at 1,100 metric tons per year. So we see where there can be a little bit of movement, a little bit of freedom in SEQA, and that discretionary power is often useful because it gives local agencies a little bit more power to change the law to better fit their community. Now I'm going to move it over to Saba. She's going to talk about the evolution of SEQA, its misuse, how it's really changed. There you go.
Yeah, I just kind of want to reiterate a lot of the points that Ara made. California has one of the strongest environmental statutes in the nation. It mandates, the review of environmental impacts of a variety of projects, mainly residential projects. And one thing I wanted to note as well was that California is currently obviously we know that we're housing crisis, but we currently have the second least housing per capita, have the largest population of homeless across the country, and obviously all of these housing demands are set by the state and across the country as well, with the regional housing needs assessment specifically for California. And so I just want to highlight the importance of getting this issue addressed because 97.6% of California cities have failed to produce enough housing over the last decade. And so I just want to cover some of the operational issues with SEQA. The main large thing is that there are no strict requirements. Part of the SEQA process involves issuing environmental impact reports or EIRs, and they can be hundreds of pages long, have up to 16 different things that they cover, and suits brought forth under SEQA only need to demonstrate a single error out of those hundreds of pages. And typically when that single error is demonstrated, it can go to the courts, it can last typically 3 to 5 years, it can definitely be more than that, and this process is also anonymous. As well as what Ara said before, this is a discretionary approval process, which means that local and public agencies essentially have all of the power in deciding whether these cases get approved, and I'll go over more of the issues with that as well in a second. And there are a lot of rounds of public and administrative proceedings. And lastly, in general, this whole process is unpredictable, expensive, and time-consuming. The main reason for that, as I mentioned with the discretionary process, is the fact that most of the time the individuals making decisions in a lot of these cases have no experience or expertise in environmental impacts. And so that can, in general, just be costly and make it very difficult to address issues. And one thing to note as well, that EIRs can range from $200,000 to millions of dollars. And on top of that, when you have to keep reissuing them, it racks up. And then I just want to go over as well as the specific types of conflicts that we see with SEQA. The first is competition. As I mentioned earlier, any individual with as I mentioned, you just have to demonstrate a single error in the environmental impact reports that are issued. And so any individual seeking any relief essentially can bring about a suit on the basis of this single issue. And so that often happens, the thing that often happens is that it can be done by anyone pursuing any agenda, even if the project causes no harm to the environment or public health. And so a lot of these actions are done, as I said, for competition, with 80% of the cases that are brought forth on infill projects, which are developments that are already there, zones that are have areas that have already been rezoned. Only 20% are done on greenfield projects. Obviously, one difficulty with these statistics is that there isn't any direct confirmation that it is for competition because all the cases are brought forth on environmental concerns. But as you can see, with 49% targeting taxpayer-funded projects that have no business or other private sector sponsors, we can infer that a lot of these cases do involve projects that private businesses and private sector sponsors do want to get involved in. And then the last sort of conflict that we found as well is NIMBYism, or the attitude of not in my backyard. And the main dilemma with this is that 64% of Californian adults do support affordable housing, but the issue is that no one wants it in their neighborhood. And so I'm also going to go over the way SEQA actions have sort of changed over the last few years, or since it's been implemented. Beginning in 1998, Class 32 exemptions were adopted, and these were mostly on infill developments. However, Class 32 did have some limitations, one of which was the fact that the language allowed for cases to still be brought up under unusual circumstances. And so there wasn't much use of it. And so as we can see in 2008, negative declarations, which are also another form of essentially another form of EIRs, were used mostly over exemptions. And then that changed in 2011 with the passage of a State Senate Bill 226, which essentially solidified the use of exemptions. And then This was also reaffirmed in 2015 with the case of Berkeley Hillside Preservation versus City of Berkeley. And essentially that case decided that the language in the state Senate bill it could be used, and that it essentially made it difficult for opposers of projects to bring forth a case for unusual circumstances. And then there was a few cases from 2015 to 2017 which kind of echoed that. And so since 2017, over 55% of actions have been exemptions. And then I'm going to pass it back over to Ara to talk a little bit more about the court process.
So now let's talk a little bit more about the weaponization of CEQA today and how it's really been taken in hands of people who have no interest in protecting the environment. So, oftentimes, most CEQA lawsuits are brought by homeowner groups, again, MBs, people who are simply unhappy with the development in their community. They usually have no prior history or knowledge of the environment or have any skin in the game, so to speak. And I think one important point to note, Leo Hanyan out of the Hoover Institute, and I always try to get an Arlington source in my study, so that's that. 85% of CEQA suits filed since 2017 were by groups that have no history of any environmental advocacy. So that's 85% who really have no interest in protecting the environment. Again, it's a delay tactic. And why is this? Because there's no enforceable deadline, there's no clear scope, and of course there's no budget. So there's a lot of movement there that creates an ability to delay a project for years. And one thing I want to talk about, one more case, is what we infer might very well be the tipping point. And that just happened a few months ago. It's Berkeley v. Save Berkeley's Neighborhoods. What this was, it was a homeowners group in Berkeley that sued UC Berkeley saying that 2,500 new students were going to be coming in. And these students is going to cause Berkeley to make more housing. They don't have sufficient housing to house them. Now, immediately what happened was, wait a minute. Immediately what happened was the courts went in and said we have to stop this because your students who have already been accepted to Berkeley are going to be getting rescission letters. They're going to have to not be able to come to Berkeley even though they were accepted. Even though there was no clear study to see if Berkeley really has insufficient housing, whether if they have to build more housing it's going to cause a negative environmental impact or not. Without that study even being conducted, already we see that that's a real world consequence. 2,500 students don't have a place to go to college. But despite that, now this is where CEQA sort of works for those that want to misuse it. Oftentimes there are one-time exemptions from the entire CEQA process, and things like this get built. SoFi Stadium here in Inglewood has 100,000 capacity. It costs $6 billion to build. Angel Stadium, 45,000 person capacity, cost almost $4 billion to build. These got complete CEQA exemptions, one-time exemptions from the California State Legislature. How this is more important than the housing crisis, I don't know. But they get complete exemptions from CEQA. So you see how this doesn't have an impact on the environment, yet housing at a small condominium does. So it's, again, the hypocrisy of the process. One more that I'd like to note. This is the Newhall Ranch development in Valencia. It was a proposed 60,000 resident community with 20,000 homes, 7 schools, thousands of acres of open land. Permits were submitted in 1994. It took until 2017 to settle all of these lawsuits. That's 23 years of CEQA lawsuits. Developer produced 109,000 pages of documents, and the estimated public cost for all these studies, $9 million. And now, it's a delay tactic again. One thing we want to point out is most of these residents, most of these people who sue, they don't have a real desire to protect the environment. It's simply a delay tactic because the studies take so long, and immediately the agencies who are tasked with conducting the studies have to stop the development to study the mitigation measures. Now we're going to compare CEQA to other state and federal laws, because I think it's important to note there are many other states since CEQA came into effect that have modeled similar environmental laws with critical foundational differences. Narrower scope, more clear analyses, parameters that make it far less overreaching and broad. And because there's no ambiguity, it allows for the state and the local agencies to know what they have to conduct, how quickly they have to conduct it. So let's compare. New York, Georgia, and Connecticut. All of these, including CEQA, apply to public projects, things like a freeway. The only one that applies to private projects, CEQA. Now, EISs, they're similar to EIRs, They're modeled like them, but there's a key difference. First of all, it mandates disclosure, but the mitigation measures are not part of the process. And it puts the onus on the developer, or if it's a public project, the contractor that's building it, to conduct this analysis and propose the mitigation measures as a prerequisite for approval in the permit process. Versus SEQA, where you apply for a permit and then the entire mitigation process, the study, the analysis takes place, and that can go on for years. Where in these other states, it's a prerequisite to get approval. And finally, because of that narrow scope, because the onus is on the developer, the budget oftentimes that the state or the local agency has to put on a single project, on average project, is $5,000 to $35,000. Obviously with CEQA, God only knows. So, one last point, how CEQA interacts with federal law. Now, the NEPA came into effect in 1969, a year before. Again, similar thing, similar attempts to protect the environment, but again, a narrower scope. What this did is that it applied to federally funded projects and allowed them to go forward, but with disclosure. The negative environmental effects would have to be disclosed, mitigation measures would have to be proposed, but it, number one, wouldn't be on the local agency's responsibility to conduct that analysis, and that disclosure would be part of the mandate. Versus CEQA, where it applies to every project, public, private, publicly funded, or privately funded. Now we're going to move back to Saba for some recommendations.
So I'm going to go over some state efforts and local efforts and state resolutions for the issue that Ara and I have been covering this whole time. So for local efforts, one thing that can be done is to include displaced developments and EIRs. And essentially displaced developments is just including the fact that if a project were to be denied at a certain location, that having the project displaced, it would, if or whether it would or would not cause significant environmental impacts in a new location. And so this would kind of be helpful in at least trying to get a project on a certain site built rather than be moved over and having to start through the process again. However, one downfall of this is the fact that it will cost more because it's included in the EIR. However, it will help in terms of at least trying to get a certain site sold. The second effort that can be done on a local level is through a cap and trade mechanism. Compensation is often overlooked in issues like this because no one really wants to put monetary value on something, on an issue that should be morally right and addressed. And so the way this would work is that jurisdictions, kind of similar to how California operates right now with greenhouse gas emissions, certain jurisdictions would have to meet a certain percentage of affordable housing. And so they would kind of go around and ask, do you have extra funding for me to go and pay all these homeowners so that I can get this, if a different jurisdiction has already met their percentage. And then lastly would be raising awareness for more federal resources. In 1987, Congress passed the Stewart B. McKinney Homeless Assistance Act, and that developed a variety of different agencies. One of them is the Housing and Urban Development Agency, and their overall goal is essentially to help build affordable housing and address homelessness in the United States. And so they provide a lot of funding and support throughout the whole process for a lot of litigation that goes on. However, some of the downfalls of that are that local providers and agencies have to be determined to pursue a case, have to know that there is a federal resource to use, and they also have to have access to legal assistance ahead of time. And then more of the state resolutions. Overall, one thing that can be done is the development of a CEQA agency. As Ara and I have mentioned, the large issue is that the whole process is through discretionary approval. And so the development of an agency, it would have dedicated expertise in regulating, enforcing, and adjudicating CEQA. And so obviously the agency would be equipped with scientists, engineers, planners, advisors, and so on the board. And this would kind of follow similarly to the South Coast Air Quality Management District in Southern California. They have all the jurisdiction, they have all the power in all of these cases. As another example would also be the Canadian Ad Hoc Environmental Review Panel. And essentially the development of an agency or a panel that would have all of this process would provide independent review of the CEQA process or CEQA lawsuits so that the whole process would be sped up. It would also create more certainty in the way that cases would be brought about and resolved, and overall cost less just because you wouldn't have to spend hours in court going through multiple EIRs. And then I'll pass it back over to Unruh for our last recommendations.
Now, these following recommendations are what we view as tweaks to SEQA. We believe they're things that would satisfy all the various stakeholders without fundamentally changing or repealing the law, and because we see that many of those wide-ranging efforts are oftentimes met with great resistance. So the first one we'd like to talk about is preventing duplicative lawsuits. Because an example, in the New All Ranch development, one person lives at 1105 and another person lives at 1107, sue for the same reason between 6 months, and it's delayed once more. The study has to be conducted once more. And all of these are about creating disincentives from the get-go. The next one is setting the deadline for SEQA suits to be filed. Again, it gives clarity. It makes it obvious that you have a certain time to conduct your analysis, decide why you're opposing it, why there's an environmental harm versus the open-ended nature of it today. Losing parties must pay court costs and attorney's fees. That applies to every other civil case. Why shouldn't it apply to SEQA? Again, disincentives. Fourth, all parties must comply with disclosure rules. We want to expose that those who are suing oftentimes have no environmental skin in the game. And by doing that from the beginning, they have to disclose their interests. It once more creates a disincentive for people who are like developers who want to just get a competitive edge from suing under SEQA. Next one is a 9-month deadline for SEQA filings to be enforced, so that gives clarity to, number one, the developers, that once there's a ruling made, in 9 months it has to be enforced. And again, for the people who are suing, that if they're simply using it as a delay tactic, it's only going to be 9 months. And so once more, a disincentive. And the last one is what we think is the most important. I'd like to read it directly. It's redefining SEQA projects, the language itself. Today, it's defined as any project undertaken by a public agency or private project subject to discretionary approval, which has a potential for resulting either a direct physical change in the environment or indirect foreseeable change, close quote. Now, we want to change this definition in 2 ways. First of all, state that that change has to be significant and cost measurable. And the second is with respect to mitigation measures. By conducting an analysis of the mitigation measure compared to the net cost of that mitigation measure. Why? Again, in the New All Ranch, one of the settlements was that the person would install, the developer would install solar power electric car charging stations in every garage. Well, right now, Californians own 1 to 2% of Californians own electric cars. And yet, so the cost of putting those in every single garage in the New All Ranch development would cost more than the supposed benefits. So immediately it would fail that test as a mitigation measure. And lastly, the perfect situation if it's repealed. We don't know if this would happen, but we'd like to note. The federal law would remain, the NEPA, no additional expenses on mitigation reports. EIS studies would continue to mandate that strict disclosure again, because at the end of the day, it's about disclosing what the environmental harm might be, not tasking local agencies with conducting major mitigation analyses, and place the onus, most importantly, place the onus and funding requirements on the developers, not the local agency, as a prerequisite to getting any kind of permit to come forth with their own conducted analyses on environmental impacts. So with that, on behalf of myself, on behalf of Salma and the entire MCJ team, we would like to thank all of you for the opportunity for carrying this out. It's been an interesting ride. I don't think I'd ever know so much about the environment. But we thank you very much. It was a great semester, and we'd be happy to take any of your questions.
Excellent. Very good job. Good job, team. Why don't we come around the table and we'll start a conversation.
Should we let them go, or what do you think about? Do they need more questions?
We can ask if they have questions, if they want to ask them first.
Yeah, I like that. No, I don't. Yeah. Anna and Maribel, do you have questions you want to ask them? Do you have any questions?
Well, I think while they're getting this set up, maybe we'll start the conversation, and then Nicole, you can just jump in with any of their questions as they sort of pose them. So I'll turn it over to you ladies. Yeah, I think you all did a really good job. It's come a long way, a lot of information, and including our new add-on here. I apologize. So whoever would like to offer up a question, fire away.
Sure. Nicole, you don't have questions yet from them, right, before I ask? Okay. First of all, thank you all so much for the thoroughness, for your energy, enthusiasm. I mean, even you guys really did a deep dive on CEQA. I mean, the jails obviously is interesting, and I think we all appreciated the opportunity to go tour Men's Central Jail, and it was an eye-opening life experience. But so thank you so much for your thoroughness and for conducting this research. The first questions I had do have to do with the jails, and let me read my question here. You talked about the case study in Cook County, the Mental Health Transition Center, that included multiple phases, including the GED program, and you did include some of the outcomes. Was there more information on the positive outcomes that it had? Because I know they ended jail oversight after 40 years, and there was a 30% decrease, I think, in recidivism. But did it talk any more? Like, how is it functioning now, 4 years later? You know, what have they seen now that now that there are long-term outcomes that they could track?
Yeah, that's a great question. So that was the most I could find on Cook County. Unfortunately, it's not something that's covered a lot, or if it is, I couldn't find anything that was available to the public. However, this article that I was sourcing from was from the Gazette, which is a local newspaper in Denver, which was basically comparing their own facilities in Denver to that of the gold standard of Cook County. And this was written in 2021.
Okay.
So I believe that these are the most recent updates we have. It's kind of hard to track recidivism, obviously, because it's just so ongoing. There's so many moving parts. But I can look more into it if you would like.
Well, that's okay. What was the impetus for the creation of the Cook County Mental Health Transition Center? Was it because they were under oversight for 40 years?
Yeah, it was basically the brainchild of the sheriff named Thomas Stark. And he has been in his current role since, I believe, about 2007. And he saw a real need, and he discussed a lot about how his facility became the biggest mental health facility in his state, and he wanted to do something about it. But also how funding was just cut a lot during the recession and the subsequent years, and he wanted to do whatever he could with his own facilities.
Interesting. And you said this was in an article about Denver, and what ended up happening in Denver? Were they exploring alternatives?
Yes, they're currently exploring alternatives.
So they're currently exploring them. They haven't done anything else.
For my research, it's just very slow work as far as I can find. I think as we're experiencing here, they're long, drawn out debates between advocates and those who are within the legislators who are in power.
Did you see other diversion programs or other municipalities that have different facilities, or were the examples pretty few and far between?
Because California tends to be a pioneer in these issues, it was kind of hard to find out-of-state examples. And I think Zane was able to find more information within the in-state.
Right.
So Chicago and Rikers, I researched several, but Chicago was the most positive example I could find, because overall in the United States, we have like a long way to go in this reform.
Do you have questions?
I do have questions. So I really liked some of the options sort of given in the sense of brain farting here. I'm like going through all my notes. Like I have like 6 pages of notes here. The incentive for bringing people on, because I know that when we had spoken to Dr. Belovich and really seeing things like just the staffing problem is hard. Were you able to kind of see of any schools that may be already partnering with local institutions at all? Because I really like the idea of maybe having an incentive program like while kids are in school. Did you see that something like that kind of already, any sort of partnerships already established in any of the research that you all were doing?
I couldn't find that out of state, but
In state, I would say not much.
Okay.
Is because again, there's the stigma around the fact that there's like communities, like engaging in community programs would not be safe and would be deemed dangerous for the community, and considering how it's for children like high school or even college students,
Right.
it is. However, I think I would say that in terms of incentivizing the jobs, based on like my conversation with people like who were officers in the jail when we went for the visit, most of them are doing that job is either because their like families were previously in the job. So like Lily said, there's not much motive for them to go to and like do a job in the jail. And like another officer was telling of how they have 6-month shifts in a very dark room, which is essentially like a prison too. So
Right.
making it more like accessible to inmates and guards should definitely be something we look into. But to the question of whether there is, I don't believe there is, at least in the research that I did.
Got it. And then I wanted to go a little bit, and I think this kind of goes back to the one in Illinois and Cook County. So we had phase 1 was the 6-week daily group sessions. And was that 6 weeks like a fixed 6 weeks, do you know? Or like if, like, let's say, 'cause my concern is always if someone doesn't demonstrate willingness to participate in a program, are they just gonna wait out the 6 weeks and then start moving on to the next phase? Or like, are there contingencies in the 6 weeks, do you know?
It's a daily program.
Okay.
And also, one thing that the article made note of is that there was a really high demand to be in this program when it started back in 2016, because this was a pilot program that's been continuing on about the last 5-6 years. And there was a quote from one of the inmates saying that basically he wanted so badly to get into the program, and that there was a comment made in the article about like there being hundreds of people wanting to get on this wait list because, and people really want to, a lot of people want to improve their lives within the jail system. And to answer the previous question that Zane touched upon, one of the reasons I believe there's not more GED resources and things like that is because those are usually reserved for the prison environments, because people are not sure how long they're going to stay within the jail facilities.
Right.
But I do think it would be worthwhile to implement within the jail system.
Got it. And then going back to the 7L locked facility, I don't know if you mentioned, how long has that sort of 7L ward been in place?
I think it was started off more as like just something that the hospital, like a hospital was connected to the prison in a way that if there was someone who fell sick in the prison, they would be transferred to that particular hospital. But I think more so in the past 7-8 years was when they actually started, like they actually implemented this ward inside the hospital. That is more for like intensive care unit patients. 7D is the one that deals with more of physical health conditions, whereas the 7L is the one that caters to, I think there was this instance with the inmate with schizophrenia. So something like that would essentially be in a ward like that. But exactly what date, I'm not sure, but I will include that in my research paper, which will you have here.
Okay. And then, I'm sure I have more, but
I
I'll
have one from
let
Anna.
them go.
I was
Yeah.
gonna say Anna Moradian texted me her question. She's our chief of staff. And she's asking, did your research indicate how improved facilities and working conditions may impact staff recruitment?
I didn't find that statistic directly, but I believe that's probably.
Yeah, I think a problem conclusion that I would draw personally from this is that if we have a facility that is also like, right now we're living in a very capitalistic society, so there is a benefit is when we invest in it. So considering that if a facility is made with the investment of like what Delarai and Key also touched upon, there would definitely be, I feel, a little rise in the I would say the experience it would attract and the kind of personality it would attract, because like even Delarai said that only 57% of the budgeted jobs are filled, even though there's a budget for people to be paid. And the reason that's happening is because there are no people doing the job. So that would mean that we need to get more people. And how we do it is, first of all, making the condition in which the people have to work in also more sustainable.
Right. Just to add on to that, I did find that having an improved facility has shown to improve the mental health rates of correctional officers and staff overall, which could lead to more recruitment.
It's great.
Oh, great.
So I'm gonna read the whole thing. So Dr. Belcher says, thank you for the presentation. You did a really nice job unpacking a very complex process. One of the major differences you mentioned is the size of Los Angeles compared to other systems. How do you think this will play into your recommendations?
I can touch on that. Yeah, it was a bit difficult doing related to this of finding comparable examples. Los Angeles County does have the biggest system in the United States, and then Rikers is close to that. Yeah, I think that really we could serve as pioneers. I think that this is an opportunity to build successful reforms that can be replicated. Because we have the biggest inmate population, we have the greatest opportunity.
Yeah, to touch on what Lily said too, like while I was drafting my policy paper too, I came across this statistic that said that 2% of entire the United States inmate population, out of the entire inmate population in the United States, 2% of them are in LA County. That might sound very less, 2%, but when you actually go down specifically into numbers, is a huge, like a very huge population. So like what Lily said, it was very difficult to find. Like technically, if you see the inmate population of San Mateo and San Francisco is nowhere close to what we have here in LA County. But then again, I chose those specifically because they are more, because my recommendations were more in terms of community diversion. Those counties were the ones that actually implemented those, and the community demographics are similar. That being said, answering Dr. Belavich's question about how we think we can implement it, we realize that we can't say like change the entire criminal justice system because that's something that's going to take a very long process. But we can definitely start implementing in small ways because now we have the opportunity. Initially, it would just be amending MCJ, but now because MCJ is being broken down, we could just see this as a, like as you would say, a blessing in disguise. It's because that's being broken down is when we're being pushed into arenas to even explore these options. So because we're being explored these options, a new facility is inevitable. We need one because we have the demand for it. We have the inmates for it. We have so many inmates to house. So because we're having a new facility, I believe we could start by implementing these recommendations in that facility. And with like experts that we already have, trying to attract more experts, I think would help start somewhere.
That's great. And then Anna has a follow-up question. Did you find walked treatment facilities in the jail context effective treatment facilities other than Cook?
I did not. I researched in Texas. I researched I've researched all over the country. And in terms of population size, I was mostly focused on that. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of recommendations. And some of the recommendations I did find on Rikers were about the closing of Rikers. Mm-hmm. So unfortunately, it was like the positivity was coming from the closure, not vice versa. Yeah.
Well, much like MCJ, I think, perhaps. Yeah. You know, I have a question for Key that I don't know if you know this, so I just want to give you my best guess. I'm assuming MCJ was built, politically speaking, at a very different time than it is today.
Yes.
Right, so the model of MCJ probably reflected where society was at in the 50s and 60s.
Yes.
Now we're in 2022. Do you have a sense at least whether there's enough political wherewithal, energy, interest in moving away from that very carceral model to something different? And I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, but that's what it's going to take, right?
Yes.
All the great ideas in the world are meaningless unless you have the political wherewithal to get it pushed through.
As of right now, I'm not entirely sure. There's outside public activists want to change the carceral environment to a rehabilitative one, but I'm not entirely sure if public and political figures want to change that so much. It's seen through the push for the passing of Measure J that the community wants more community-based programs, but there's so much to be said about that than actual political figures wanting to make an actual switch from a carceral state to a rehabilitative one. And that takes, as I think Lily mentioned, it takes effort and a want to change from a carceral setting to a rehabilitative one.
Thanks. We certainly can't leave out CEQA.
I was gonna say,
Right.
we've got questions on that too.
Cool.
And then I didn't have a chance to formally introduce, this is Robert Alvarez, he's our assistant planning deputy. Anish Sarai, who you guys met previously, is out of town for his brother's wedding. So Robert is here on his behalf, and I don't know if you have questions on CEQA. I have a couple, but
Yeah, I did. So you guys talked about CEQA and some of the projects, and you talked about the difficulty both in public and private projects. Based on the things that you cited, so as some of the big projects, are there any kind of opportunities to look at projects that could be potentially lobbied to have some exemption or opportunities like that in terms of short-term changes?
I think that the expansion and the fast tracking of exemptions, and I talked about this a little bit too, so I'll defer to you in a minute, but the exemptions are really a fast track way, a quick way to do some of the things that we want to. As far as the appetite for doing that, I showed some examples. The exemptions for the most part are for major projects, and they're a one-time California State Legislature vote, as I'm sure you know. So framing the issue that one-time housing facilities, perhaps they're the low-income housing buildings, whatever it may be, to get those one-time exemptions. The question is whether there's a political appetite to do that, because obviously a stadium is built that services 100,000 spectators versus a condo which might be for 20 people. So can you do an exemption for every single one of those? That's the question, I think. But I think that if it's a large-scale development, a large-scale housing development, certainly exemptions are a quick way to do this. Whether that would apply, that's a different way, but I think it certainly is a rapid way to sort of solve some of these problems without having to get into the nitty-gritty of reforming.
can I ask a follow-up on that?
Yeah.
You one of my questions on it was to ask about the appetite, whether it's politically or publicly. And you just referenced, asking about the political appetite and the stadium examples. But I think the question is, when you guys were doing your research, how much did you see out in discourse? How much do regular members of the public know about CEQA and know how much it impacts lack of housing or anything having to do with their daily lives? Or when you guys were doing your research, did you find that most of the information was pretty much, for people in the know, or if you happen to be looking specifically for CEQA?
Yeah, at least for me, most of the research that I found was like scholarly sources, all of them calling for like some sort of reform. I did find a few that were like news articles that kind of just talked about it, but they mainly gave like history, and it didn't really have like a position. At least a lot of the exemptions that or the process of exemptions in general that I researched were covered a lot in news articles and more like common sources. A lot of it was also just like mentions of certain state Senate bills that were trying to get pushed through or did successfully get pushed through. But a lot of it didn't really discuss the issues that were faced.
Were there a number? Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the question of appetite, I think, should be framed that, it's well intended. Who doesn't want to protect the environment? But it's the scope and the ambiguity of the law that causes these things to happen, the misuse. And certainly in my research, not a lot of people know about it. Those that are in the know, the appetite is lacking, in my opinion. Perhaps it's changing a little bit because sometimes it's just absolutely, for lack of a better term, absurd.
Yeah.
Why do 2,500 students who are already accepted to a university have to get a letter that says you can't come when there's been no analysis if they have to build more units? So whether we're going to get to a point where it's going to be a tipping point and they're going to say this is just too much, perhaps that might be the cause, but there's not enough knowledge of it because on the face of it, it protects the environment. You can put a picture of, a grizzly bear up and say that's what we're protecting, and people won't question it. But certainly, a little bit of research really shows. So I think it's a messaging question, how to illustrate that misuse, how to show that misuse. We see the homelessness, we see that. So there's, I think, a question of framing the argument.
Professor Auerbach, did we get a copy of the presentation?
Yeah, you'll get all their papers too.
I was going to say, that would be great.
Yeah, I was going to tell you, I saw you all taking natty notes, but you'll get everything.
That's okay.
I have a follow-up question. You guys talked about 85% of the groups that filed the lawsuits. Is there any kind of study or research in terms of who these groups are and what they do afterwards? Do they continue doing this work? as we all know, negative circumstances tend to rally a community.
Sure.
But what is your work kind of outside of CEQA and that scope?
Well, that number was from a Cato Institute study done in partnership with Hoover up in Stanford. Now, most of these will, as I said, file duplicative lawsuits. So if 85% of people are suing without any environmental interest, the neighborhoods will band together and do it again. Delay tactics are often the main cause of why we see CEQA lawsuits. So it doesn't in any way de-incentivize because there's no environmental interest by these groups. I think rather it makes it easier for them to get it, adds fuel to the fire, for lack of a better term. So no, the groups don't, I don't think, they're not disincentivized by that. It's just more reason to file them again.
And then I'm interested, did you guys look at how local municipalities affect CEQA? So are there, one of the big conversations now is the environment again, and there are pushes to look at these things. Are there any laws or things that you guys have seen, any momentum that could potentially make the CEQA process more difficult when you add local jurisdictions into the mix?
You want to do the local, Selva? That is sort of your portion.
Yeah.
If you don't know, it's fine. It's
I mean, I mainly don't know. I know the only thing like with local efforts is just the fact that there is a lot of discrepancies across the state because all of the local officials, like governments, agencies, they all have, like I mentioned, discretion and power in the decision of the cases. And obviously, if the answer that gets around, the answer that the courts get around to obviously can go up through the process and hopefully get to the state and that will be resolved. But it doesn't seem like that's what's happening. It seems like a lot of the actions are just done by local governments and that they all are different across the state. And that was kind of the example that Ara mentioned with the Bay Area, because their standard of air quality is 10 times higher than what the CEQA standard is.
And there's flexibility there. I mean, it's by nature a decentralized protocol. So that gives opportunity for positive steps, but also for certain local agencies to go crazy and shoot down any sort of development. So I think there's movement there and there's an opportunity because it's decentralized. I mean, environment is important. Local agencies have the ability and power. There are already structures in place at various municipality levels to do real good analysis, make decisions, and create mitigation measures without the need for having this umbrella system. So I think the structure exists already.
So we are at 1:30. I want to be mindful of everyone's time.
We should probably head back.
Okay, yeah.
Be captivated.
I
But I
know,
wanted-
we could continue to talk and ask questions.
But I just want to thank you all. I think you all did a great job. So here's to